Dr. Callaghan, over the next decade, there's a number of commemorations that will be occurring. Which do you think are the most important that will be commemorated?
Well, Paul, there's a powerful public memory of political violence in Ireland and revolutionary violence, and most of the focus seems set to be on events and issues pertaining to the national question. But there was much more to the 1910s and the 1920s than that. Even in the last few years, a number of important social reforms, their centenaries have passed us by virtually unnoticed. So for instance, in 1908, Lloyd George introduced the Old Age Pensions Act, and that same year he proposed what was to become the National Insurance Act of 1911, which provided for unemployment benefit for workers. And I think it's worthwhile reflecting on what those developments meant for people then and what they still mean to people. So liberal reforms like these, limited and all as they may have been, were designed to combat poverty, social isolation, social exclusion. But unsurprisingly, Conservatives view them as dangerous attempts to redistribute wealth. So when John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party then found themselves holding the balance of power in Westminster after the 1910 general election, their reward for supporting the Liberals was a Home Rule Bill. And that Home Rule Bill, along with World War I, of course, provided the catalyst for much of the political conflict of the following decade. So, 1912, Ulster Solemn League and Covenant was signed. The following year, 1913, the Ulster Volunteer Force was formed in response to that. The Irish Volunteers emerged. Also in 1913, of course, the Dublin Lockout, formation of the Irish Citizens' Army. In 1914, there was the outbreak of World War I, and the war continued until 1918. So within that period of World War, you had in 1916 the Easter Rising, followed some months later by the Battle of the Somme. In 1918, there was the conscription crisis. There was Sinn Féin's triumph in the general election. The suffragist movement, by that point we should remember, had secured the vote for women over 30 at least. 1919 to 21 then were probably the crucible years of the revolution. The War of Independence was fought. The first Dáil met. The island was partitioned. All of this before the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. Then, of course, came the Civil War, 1922 to 23. And by that time, 1923 and the end of the Civil War, there was still much that was left undecided and unresolved. So to impose an end date for any series of commemorations of 1923 is perhaps a little bit arbitrary. Now, whatever debates and arguments emerge, they'll be most productive if they revolve around existing historical research supplemented by new research. And that new research, hopefully, will not only deepen our understanding of the revolutionary period, but broaden our interpretation and our conception of it also.
Given that there might be controversy over what is to be commemorated, how do you think these should be conducted?
Well, many of these events were bitterly divisive, so I think that commemoration provides us with a great opportunity to challenge crude versions of our history and to tackle as well any popular misconceptions that may be abroad. Now, we must remember that commemoration does not necessarily mean celebration, and that the two things are not the same. And there's a danger as well potentially in tribalism or in triumphalism. Now, having said that, on the other hand, there could be a problem if too much emphasis is placed on political correctness. And what we could end up with in that situation, rather than real and lively historical debate, is simply a series of pieties and of backslapping.
What about if you did one big commemoration?
Well, again, I think it is fair to say that all of these events are inextricably intertwined, but we should avoid lumping centenaries together or bracketing them together if we are simply going to impose artificial boundaries on them. Now, one way to look at the whole time period, I suppose, is that there is just one history, but different people, depending on their political background, their cultural background, will emphasise or will concentrate on different aspects of that history and draw on it as they need it. So there's a role certainly for historians in all of this, in negotiating between these difficulties. There's a role for official, state-sponsored commemorative events, as there will be a role for history led by interested parties outside of the government or outside of the universities. So what we might end up with could be, rather than a series of streamlined one-off events, a discourse which is contestable.
This isn't the first series of commemorations we had in the country. There must be a history of it.
Oh, absolutely, Paul. I think 1916 is probably the best example in this regard, and the most instructive for our purposes. And it's always been somewhat challenging for anyone involved in commemoration and somewhat awkward. There are many questions that have to be answered about 1916. Who benefited from it? Who inherited its legacy? What did it represent? Who did it represent? So even then, in the early years of the Free State, the relatives of the leaders of the rebellion were conspicuous by their absence in many cases. By 1966, the 50th anniversary of the Rising, it was really what amounted to a national celebration, I think it's fair to say, of the Rising. Now, critics of that later deemed it irresponsible and suggested that it had acted as a call to arms for impressionable young nationalists north of the border. But I think that's rather simplistic, and it ignores more cogent factors in the explosion of violence in the north in the late 60s. By the 75th anniversary of the Rising then, in 1991, obviously this was set against the background of the Troubles, and the commemoration was a much more muted affair. But the political climate had evolved again by the time of the 90th anniversary of the Rising in 2006, to the point where the military dimension, the military character of the events was much more pronounced. Now, I think as well we should remember that commemoration often has more to do with politics than with history. And the centenary of the Rising, the commemoration of that centenary, may well tell us more about 2016 than it will about 1916. So I think there's probably a role for historians there as well.
What role do you think historians should play in this?
Well, commemoration can amount to the politicisation of memory. So I would suggest, or I would argue, that it's incumbent upon historians and incumbent upon academics to provide academic leadership in terms of the public history of the next decade.
But what did you say if they engage with the commemoration industry?
Well, commemoration as an industry, some would argue, certainly purists would argue, that historians should have little to do with it, little if anything. The reality, of course, is different. The reality is that these events will occur whether or not historians are involved. And if historians do not participate in setting the agenda, well, then others will, others who will have different priorities.
So where does that leave historians as public intellectuals?
Well, historians as public intellectuals, there's a certain catch-22 involved there, I think. And the dilemma is this. What is the purpose of the historian in terms of commemoration? Should the historian attempt to mobilise historical knowledge in the hope of enhancing cross-community understanding, or should the historian limit herself or himself strictly to historical research in pursuit of abstract understanding?
And where does historical accuracy fit into all this?
Well, historical accuracy has to be paramount, I think, and sometimes the facts, and if the facts are the business of the historian, sometimes they will make us uncomfortable. And if that is the case, well, reconciliation doesn't necessarily enter the equation. Now, Thomas Kettle, the former nationalist MP for East Tyrone, he served in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers in the war, and he was killed during the war. But his hope had been that the tragedy of the war, as he acknowledged it, the sacrifice of the war, his hope was that it might inspire reconciliation between Protestant Ulster and Ireland, and then between Ireland and Great Britain. Now, as we know, that didn't happen, and in fact, the war accentuated Irish political divisions, and it provided the context of the Revolution. So, without the First World War, the Revolution might not have happened at all. It certainly would not have taken the form and the shape that it did. Now, having said all of that, commemoration as well should not just be the preserve of academic historians. There are a whole range of people, a whole range of groups, artists, writers, novelists, poets, filmmakers, documentary makers. One of the things the commemoration has to do is to engage with popular history, both north and south. And those groups, those people, may well do a better job of that than historians.
So what do you think will be the outcomes of these commemorations?
Well, there are certain parts of Irish history that always seem to be on the verge of being played out, yet they never are, and they remain live issues. But that's the nature of history, I suppose. And it might be too much to expect, or too much to hope even, that anything will be definitively resolved over the next decade. As of yet, it's not even clear whether the Moore Street GPO battlefield from the 1916 Rising will survive, or whether it will be turned into a shopping centre. Now, ironically enough, the recession seems to be a friend of history in this instance, but it might be fair to say that history doesn't have many other friends. And in some respects, history is a little bit like the canary in the coal mine. What is the bare minimum that it can survive on? In the junior cert curriculum, for instance, the place of history seems to be under threat. And it's important to acknowledge that the relationship that people have with history and that people have with their past is very fragile, and it's malleable. So less history means less rounded citizens, and in that context then perhaps the best result, or the most tangible result that we might take from commemorations in the years to come is that there will be more history available to people, that it will be good history, but what constitutes good history is a question for another day perhaps.
Thank you, John.